I'm really excited to be here. I want to thank all of you for coming. I think it's fairly clear as Hurricane Ike bears down upon us that this could not be a more urgent issue. The sad reality is that disasters are getting more common and more expensive, mostly because of the way we live, the way we've migrated to big cities near water and stripped the land of its natural protections. So it becomes very urgent to figure out how we can create a force multiplier with the millions of people who always come forward after big disasters and often are sent away or not well utilized. In many cases they are, but there's clearly a sort of choke point that we need to figure out how to leverage people, regular people, since it's such an underutilized and major asset, and since we're going to keep having disasters whether we like it or not. So that's sort of some context for this conversation. What I'm going to do is introduce each of the panelists briefly and then ask each of them to take about 2 minutes to talk to you about what they think of this issue and what's on their minds. And then I'm going to get the ball rolling with a couple of questions and then open it up to the audience. We are going to stop by 12 because I know you've got things that are coming up after that. So I'll try to keep things moving without being too obnoxious, but you will be the judge. We're going to start here with Walter, who is many, many things. He has written books on Ben Franklin, Einstein, Kissinger. He was CEO of CNN and is now the CEO of the Aspen Institute. He's a New Orleans native and the vice chairman of the Louisiana Recovery Authority. He was also my first boss at Time Magazine, so I'm particularly grateful to him for being here. And next to him, we have Joanna Henry, who's a real live volunteer. She has served with the National Civilian Community Corps in the Gulf Coast and the West Coast. She's currently working at NIH, just moved to Washington, D.C. She's from Florence, South Carolina, and she graduated last year from the College of Charleston. Next to her, we have Dr. Scott Cowan, who's the president of Tulane University, also an author and a professor. Since Katrina, he's also become an expert on wind, rain, and what it takes to get a large university back up and running at nearly full capacity a few months after a catastrophe. He's a member of the Bring New Orleans Back Commission and has been a leader in the effort to rebuild the city's schools. Next to him, we are very grateful to have Jennifer Epplett-Riley, who is here on behalf of Lieutenant Governor Mitch Landrieu, who could not be here due to a certain hurricane. Jennifer is the chair of City Year Louisiana and a community leader in Louisiana, and we thank her for being here and bringing some on-the-ground messages that she has for you about what's going on. Bill Novelli is the CEO of the AARP. He's also a PR legend, the co-founder of Porter Novelli, and he has held leadership positions with the Peace Corps, Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, and CARE, among other things. So I'd like to now ask each person, I guess we'll start the opposite direction, if you'd like to start down there, and take about 2 minutes to address the audience and say what's on your mind.
Well, thank you, Amanda. Good morning, everybody. Seeing the images of so many frail and elderly persons among the victims of Hurricane Katrina and Rita was shocking. And such suffering should never happen to anybody at any age, but older and disabled Americans face unique challenges in dealing with disasters. Many have limited mobility, are incapacitated, or suffer from chronic illnesses, and many more depend upon medication for their survival. And for those whose homes are destroyed, they haven't just lost a place to live, but they've lost their biggest retirement security as well. And when the results of Hurricane Ike, the evacuation, are analyzed, let's hope we did a better job there with the most vulnerable. Now, as we plan for future disasters, we need to protect the most vulnerable members of society, those who are most likely to suffer. Legislation already requires that hospitals and nursing homes develop emergency plans for evacuating and placing their residents during a disaster. But during the aftermath of Katrina, it seemed that some of those plans were virtually inoperable, resulting in the preventable deaths of many older persons. However, in many other instances, care facilities successfully moved their patients, saving the lives of many thousands of elderly people. And all this raises a number of very important questions. Why did some emergency plans work in some communities while they ended in tragedy elsewhere? Who should be ultimately responsible for ensuring proper evacuation? Can community-based voluntary efforts make a significant difference in survival rates? Could the positive experiences in certain locales, like specialized shelters for the most medically needy, be replicated on a larger scale? Now, we may have learned some lessons, but at this point, it seems that we have as many questions as we have answers. And that's why we're here, to find a better way to pull together and work out more effective plans for the future. I've worked on a number of international disasters when I was at CARE, and American organizations and volunteers are front and center in many of those situations. Hubert Humphrey said decades ago that the moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. We've got to act with resolve to minimize the needless loss of life when the next disaster strikes. We all know, and it's why we're gathered here for Service Nation, that the moral test that Humphrey posed is not governments alone. It belongs to all of us. And we heard that last night from the two presidential candidates. Thank you very much.
And my name is Jennifer Eplett-Riley, and I am here pinch hitting for Lieutenant Governor Landrieu, who is, of course, leading back in Louisiana, awaiting the whatever comes with Hurricane Ike. And he is also, of course, still leading in the aftermath of Gustav. I know for us, it's been an extraordinary couple of weeks, both preparing for Gustav and then dealing with the aftermath of Gustav, which I'm going to get to in a minute. I'm here today also representing City Year. And City Year is a youth service program where we recruit 17 to 24-year-olds from across the nation, totally diverse, different backgrounds, different neighborhoods, different racial and socioeconomic backgrounds, to serve for a full year, primarily with children in schools, mentoring and tutoring children, running after school programs, vacation camps, and leading service programs with children. City Year is a 20-year-old organization. We have 19 sites across the nation here in the United States and one in South Africa. We had never been in the disaster response business until 3 years ago, when we actually had been laying the groundwork to start a City Year in Louisiana. Mitch Landrieu had been a huge supporter of it. We were planning to go to another site and learn more about it to start a program in Baton Rouge when Katrina and then Rita struck. And because of the incredible outpouring of support from across the nation and certainly the globe, we were able to start a City Year in Louisiana focused on meeting the critical needs of children and families after the hurricane in 100 days, when it normally takes 2 years to start a City Year. So our core members came, many of them were from across the nation, because a lot of the young people in Louisiana were still dealing with their own personal tragedies in many cases. And so it was extraordinary to see that it was a defining moment for young people across the nation to say, I'm signing on right now. Either I'm re-enlisting, they'd already served a year in service and were re-enlisting to serve again, or they were just leaving their jobs or other educational opportunities to come to serve in Louisiana. And so our focus after Katrina and Rita was really serving in the transitional communities, primarily with children, running programs for them, certainly dealing with a lot of post-traumatic stress issues, and providing educational and just play activities for them. And we also served in the schools in Baton Rouge, where we had a tremendous number of children who were in flux, of course. They couldn't go back to New Orleans for many, many months. And then when we were able to serve in New Orleans, we did a lot of debris clearing, house gutting, and preparing schools to be ready to have children come back into school. We have an ongoing program now. We've been up and running for 3 years. And we didn't quite know we were going to get back in the disaster business until 2 weeks ago in the preparation of Gustav. We are, of course, all feeling very blessed that the levees held and that New Orleans is okay relatively. But Gustav was a very serious storm. It hit in Terrebonne Parish in the south, came through Baton Rouge, and then all the way up north. It was a 50-year storm. It wasn't the 100-year storm that Katrina was. But just this morning, we've been out of power for a week, so the first newspaper I read was yesterday on the way up here. But we had the largest evacuation of people in preparation of Gustav. 1.9 million residents were evacuated. 1.5 million residents were without power. We had to rally 13,000 National Guard members to come. The federal and state bill for Gustav already is $500 million. The agricultural industry has suffered $400 million of losses, and the estimated insurance bill is $10 billion. So it's challenging to think if we're going to have 50-year and 100-year storms within 3 years of each other, and who knows what Ike is going to bring us. What kind of disaster policy are we going to have here in the United States? And what kind of resources are we going to rally to build effective partnerships between the service and philanthropic sectors and those resources at the federal government level? It's been wonderful to see Vista and Habitat, Tulane and LSU students, NCCC and Hands-On and the National Guard serving with us in the last week. And I think there's tremendous potential for us to really tap young people to serve both in the preparation of disasters and also serving in the aftermath. Your turn.
You know, it's hard to believe it was a little over 3 years ago that Hurricane Katrina made land on the Gulf Coast area. Matter of fact, it was August 29th, 2005. I was an eyewitness to Katrina and evacuated that city a week later. So I know firsthand what it's like to go through a disaster, not just the immediate aftermath, but the residue of the disaster and how it stays with you for years. There's no doubt that Katrina was a defining moment for our city and for America, and for those of us who went through it. And it is very painful 3 years later to just have gone through Gustav and to have evacuated again. And of course, sit here this morning tracking Ike literally every 5 minutes, knowing that for the most part, New Orleans will be safe, but that doesn't make us happy because somebody else will be in danger. As I think about the last 3 years, one of the things I have discovered is that I really do believe that Tulane University in New Orleans will be a better and stronger city because of that great tragedy. And out of every great tragedy, there comes the opportunity for hope and for a future. And where I don't think we would have ever wished tragedy on New Orleans and its citizens, I think the fact that somehow we have transformed that into a better city is very, very important every time we look at one of these disasters. What's the source of my optimism about Tulane? Well, we, before the storm, were the largest private employer in Orleans Parish. Today, we're the largest employer in Orleans Parish. And as we were able to recover, so did our city. Matter of fact, when we reopened in January of 2006, the population of the parish went up 20% in 72 hours. We understand our responsibility to our city and to those at the university itself. In that last 3 years, we've seen our own applications to the university go from 17,000 to 35,000. Why? Because students all over America have been touched by that great tragedy and want to come to New Orleans to be part of a great academic institution, but more importantly, to participate in the recovery of a great American city. Right after Katrina, by the way, Tulane University made public service a requirement for graduation. We're the first major research university in the country to do that. Last year alone, our students participated at 100,000 hours to the New Orleans community in all walks of life. And I'm extraordinarily proud of what they have accomplished, but more importantly, the lessons they are learning about life for the future. My optimism about New Orleans and the future is this. Before Katrina, we had a lot of problems in our city. We had problems with public education, healthcare, neighborhoods, crime, and levees. And the fact of the matter is today, we're actually working on all of those particular issues. And I have no doubt in my mind that New Orleans will be a better city because we will have a better public education system. We will have a better healthcare system. We will do a better job with crime, and our neighborhoods will be better when we get them rebuilt. But here is my final comment. The source of my optimism is what the citizens did in New Orleans to make this happen. The gains we have had in New Orleans is not because of the federal government, the state government, or the city government. It is because of people like you and me and everybody else who individually and collectively have band together and say we will not fail. It is the best experiment in civil society and advanced citizenship that I have ever witnessed in my years on this earth. We are not a rich city. We are not endowed with Fortune 500 companies or people of great wealth. But it is not the money at this moment in time, even though money is important, it's the will that individuals have. So one of the reasons I inspired to come to this Service Nation conference to individually and institutionally commit more is because I have seen the power of citizen service at a time of great need, and I am awed by that power, and it serves as an inspiration. And anything we could do to take our experience and somehow graft it onto others in America so they feel every day that's part of their DNA, that is time well spent. That's why I'm proud to be a New Orleanian, proud to be a Tulanian, and most of all, an American. Thank you.
Bravo.
Again, my name is Joanna Henry, and I'm here as an alumni for AmeriCorps National Civilian Corps. And what it is an organization of members 18 to 24 that take 10 months of their time to travel around the United States to do service projects. In the area of disaster services since 2000, AmeriCorps NCCC has done 950 disaster service projects, fought fires on 500,000 acres of land, and 262 members have supported the 9/11 relief efforts. More specifically, for Katrina, 3,100 NCCC members have served in the Gulf since for Katrina. They've assisted 3 million people, coordinated work of 220,000 volunteers, and refurbished and constructed 12,000 homes. More specifically for me, 4 of my months were spent in Biloxi, Mississippi, working with Urban Life Missions and St. Bernard Parish in Louisiana for the St. Bernard Project. My team of 12 members worked on 15 homes and actually completed 7. What was shocking for me when I went to New Orleans this past year was that since the storm, it was so many people that were still in need of help. So it is my hopes for all disaster relief that once the disaster is over, that people will remember that service still needs to be done.
Thank you, Joanna. That was great, Joanna, and thank you so much for all you did. I also want to tout Amanda Ripley's book about how to survive a disaster, which is an interesting concept that is at the core of this. I want to explore very quickly one intellectual idea that I think is important for us at this Service Nation Summit. It comes right out of what Joanna said, which is that there are so many people in this country who hunger to help and to be of service, and there's so much need for that service at times, and yet in between, that ability to coordinate and get people to provide service is lacking at times. When I was first involved with the Louisiana Recovery Authority after Katrina, I would get 20, 30 phone calls a day from people say, I want to help, I want to volunteer, I want to do something. And it was so hard to say, here's how I can connect you, here's how you can do something. Eventually, people found channels and conduits, but that's what we're missing in America right now, is the easy channel and conduit that says you can come down and help. AmeriCorps plays a great role, and we just heard from Joanna how a person like her could come and help because of AmeriCorps, but that's a limited pipeline of people who can come down. Likewise, Teach for America, which I'm involved with, was crucial because Teach for America Corps members and alumni came surging down after the storm to help rebuild the school system. They helped create new academies, charter schools, New New Orleans, which Sarah Houston, who had been involved with Teach for America, had done. So that was a conduit because that alumni corps of Teach for America was organized. But we did not have the same type of conduit helping to come down to restart the hospitals or to restart the police department or to get the courts up and running. One of the things that I hope our country will create coming out of this summit is a civilian reserve corps, something where there is a role for government to help create something like this in which there are teachers, engineers, lawyers, doctors, people who can respond to an emergency, whether it's in Iraq and Afghanistan or after Katrina or Ike, to help kickstart something, just as the military reserves or the National Guard helps restore order. These people could restore electricity, schools, and other things, and help channel the energy of volunteer and service people who want to come down and do it. I watched the good groups who knew how to do it. frankly, with all due respect, for example, the Red Cross was a bit clueless and you couldn't find them, but they were the people who should have been organizing that servicing. Instead, Hands On did it very well. They were the people who brought down, as I said, Teach for America did it. Tulane, in particular, took the lead. I mean, Scott has been not only an inspiration to the city, but he was probably the person who was the single most important individual in bringing the city of New Orleans back. When it came to schools, soon when it comes to neighborhood health clinics, which I think Tulane is going to talk about today. We did not have that from government. We didn't have it from FEMA. We did not have it on the state and local level. But Tulane helped bring things back into order. So I think what we all have to come away from this summit thinking is, how do we provide the conduit for people who want to serve? And it's institutions like government and universities like Tulane and organizations like Hands On Network and Teach for America that I think will be important in doing it. I'll end by echoing what Scott says, which is, having played that role, you may have missed a statistic that Scott threw out. The number of people applying to Tulane has more than doubled. People come up to me all the time now and say, I want to go to Tulane. I introduced Scott to somebody today who's a journalist friend of mine, says, my kid wants to go to Tulane. It would not have been in that person's head had Tulane not stepped forward and created this idea of service. They would be at Vanderbilt, Emory, Rice, other southern universities. But the fact that applications to Tulane have more than doubled because of Tulane's role in service shows the hunger there is for this in the world. Likewise, the fact that we have doubled the number of core members for Teach for America in the Gulf South region is another example. And so I'll leave you with that institutions who do step forward tend to be embraced.
Thank you. Thank you, Walter, and to all of our panelists. There's a lot to think about there. I think, I want to get right into how do we get to that place, because I think Walter and the panelists are right that there's a mismatch, there's a supply and there's a demand, and they're not being met. And there's sort of two competing theories from what I can tell, talking to first responders, emergency officials, and nonprofits. One theory is that we need a much bigger, more aggressive federal core, as Walter has advocated, and he can speak to this in more detail perhaps. Another theory is the opposite, that we need to decentralize, perhaps using technology, to create sort of disaster wikis. This is a big, one person who's very big behind this is Eric Holdeman, who was head of Seattle and King County's emergency office for many, many years and is a big thinker in this area. So in other words, instead of centralizing it, bring it down to the people so that everybody's registered, and FDNY can post on the wiki, we need socks and we need shoes, and Nike can donate them, and cut out the middleman so that it's in existence beforehand, and then during and after the disaster it continues. There are problems with each of those solutions. Neither is easy, neither is perfect, but I guess I'd ask the panelists, what is their preference, knowing all that you do, knowing that we have this huge problem where volunteers are not being matched as effectively as they should be. Many times they are matched very well, but we're not leveraging this resource as well as we could. Anybody have any immediate response?
I just want to say they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it is a very good question of what you would emphasize. And obviously the wiki model is very attractive, and we want to do that. However, I would stress that there is a role for government and a role for major institutions, whether it's Tulane University, the state of Louisiana, or FEMA, to say we're going to get a core that's going to organize things. There's nothing worse than after a storm having so many people want to volunteer and people all over the place with hammers trying to figure out where's the nail for me to hammer.
I would have to underscore what Walter said. First of all, I don't think necessarily these are mutually exclusive. But if I had to have a bias, it is for the more centralized SWAT teams who come in and are ready to come in on those key functions that are critical after disaster itself. I remember the hours and sort of days after Katrina, getting literally thousands of emails from people around the country who wanted to help, and I had no way to mobilize them to do anything. Matter of fact, it was at a time like that, that's the last thing you can think of is how to mobilize all the energy around the country. You want somebody else to do that for you. So if there was something, and there's been discussion of a disaster corps, if there was something like that and they were set up around areas like health, like public education, like infrastructure, and they could come in quickly, it would seem to me that would be extremely beneficial. What would be incumbent on us as big institutions and as government is to make sure we had a single point of contact, a portal. So they got plugged in very effectively and they went out, as opposed to figure out, well, who do I call in the city or who do I call at the large institutions? But I would opt, quite honestly, for something equivalent to a disaster corps or some centralized function. And then, of course, we'll always get the grassroots approach, and we need to find better ways to organize that grassroots. But I think in the case of a disaster, where time is of the essence, we need a team to parachute in right away and get things done.
I think you'd get more grassroots support if you had that team,
You might.
because they could plug in.
Yeah.
I also think there's a distinction between what happens in the immediate aftermath, in the relief phase, and then the longer-term recovery phase in the aftermath of disasters. And, for us, in the last couple of weeks after Gustav, it is all about information, figuring out what is it in real time, what are the needs assessments at each shelter, in each community, in each neighborhood, and information, of course, is gold. And so, we have had the sort of volunteer calls from the Emergency Operations Command on a daily basis. Organizations call in every day and share information on real-time needs, and then also resources that have come to the table. But you still have breakthroughs. I mean, I was at the Baton Rouge Food Bank the day before I came up here, and they ran out of food yesterday. They were still waiting 10 days for 8 FEMA trucks of food to arrive with no explanation. I mean, it's unacceptable. So, I mean, what we did at City Year is we rallied our national partners. We reached out to folks, and who came on board? Aramark. Aramark is hooking up with the Baton Rouge Food Bank to make sure that they get food supplies. We're still trying to feed 100,000 meals a day in the Louisiana area after Gustav. So sometimes you just find that when something doesn't really make sense, you just fill the need any way you can. There's a lot of creative resource development that goes on in real time. Do we need to do it that way? Would it be better to have somebody that would come in and some SWAT team that was experienced on the ground? Even though every disaster is different, I think there's a whole lot of learning that needs to be incorporated. That, I'm not sure, I don't know what you think, Scott and Walter, after Katrina, whether or not we've done the learning. I mean, if FEMA is still having issues in this storm, and potentially let's see what happens with Ike, how do we make sure that we're constantly learning so that we're not making the same mistakes over and over again?
Yeah, I think these are all great points. And I want to emphasize that in every disaster, even smaller ones, volunteers get turned away. I was thinking about this last night, and I just did a quick search, and I was able to instantly find like 8 examples of volunteers getting turned away in the last year. The oil spill in San Francisco Bay, remember this? The biggest oil spill in nearly 2 decades, 58,000 gallons of oil in the bay. Hundreds of people came forward to clean that up, and they were turned away. And then they finally started holding classes to train people to clean up the oil, and there were too many volunteers for the classes, so they were turned away. The wildfires in San Diego last fall, flooding in Illinois, flooding in Cedar Rapids, tornado at the Boy Scout camps, not to mention the cyclone in Burma, but don't even get me started on that. So there's lots here to work with, and it seems like there's sort of 3 problems when you talk to first responders, and I want to get our panelists' thoughts on this, about what creates problems for them with volunteers as opposed to solving problems. And the first is that they tend to come when the disaster is happening or afterward. And that's human nature, I think, to an extent. You can improve on that a little, but people are not generally as motivated to come forward for training in advance. So we have to think of creative ways to improve upon that. I don't think we're ever going to solve it completely. So then you have to somehow train on the fly, train quickly. Second thing is fear of litigation. This is huge in all emergency response and emergency planning. Don't ever underestimate it. That many people are turned away. This was the case in San Francisco Bay because they don't want people to get hurt and then sue them and on and on and on. So that's another issue. And often what I've found is that it's more imagined than real, that fear, but that's a whole nother issue. And the third one is that the people are just overwhelmed. As our panelists have said, they just don't have the bandwidth to take care of these volunteers and place them. The same amount of energy is required to place an organization as it is an individual, which is why it's so important to be affiliated beforehand with an organization. Unfortunately, just walking up Joe Schmo can often create a problem if you have no connection to an organization. So those seem to be the 3 biggest problems: training, fear of litigation, and not enough bandwidth. So how do we get, I agree that the Red Cross and a lot of organizations that are already out there should be doing this on a more macro scale. Specifically, does anyone have any ideas, sort of one thing we could do to leverage that to get, why hasn't Red Cross, why haven't the large organizations that already exist been able to take it to the next level and get beyond that inflection point?
I don't know if I have a solution. I'll give you an observation of one of the things we encountered. Besides the fact that the Stafford Act has to be totally rewritten.
Good point.
Let's start there. The Stafford Act is not an act that responds to people in disaster. It's an obstacle. It's not a facilitator. But I would say, in many ways, it has to start with the federal government. And I want to give an example, and I'm not going to use real names because it's too embarrassing. But shortly after the storm, it was within a week, I went to Washington, D.C. and met with one of the cabinet members who will go unnamed. And I was trying to communicate what was going on the ground and the kinds of things that were needed on the ground. And they were needed instantaneously. And instead what I got back was about, they didn't know whether legally they could do that, whether if they did it, it would lead to litigation. And I'm thinking, if the federal government is worried about this at this moment in time, we have a serious, serious problem. So I'd start with the Stafford Act, and then my guess is there has to be a new culture at the federal level, certainly have to go down to the state level and the local level, about flexibility in a time of disaster and putting away that fear.
Yes.
Understanding it may be real, but there's a time where you have to make a leap of faith to save lives and people, and people have to be willing to do that. But I'd start at the federal level first.
You know, it's an interesting question, and I don't know if anybody's here from the Red Cross, but...
Better not be.
Oh, no. I mean, they've gone through a lot of leadership crises in the past few years, but the Red Cross could have stepped forward and said, we are going to be the people who train true disaster responders, not just take blood and hand out food and coffee, but be the people who say, we're going to be the conduit. And it could have redefined the mission of that organization. And I don't know why they didn't do it. I'm still on the side, though, that believes, like Scott said, that there is a definite role for government to help figure out how to break through things and coordinate. It is so hard when volunteers and people who want to be of service call up 3 days after the storm. One of the things that most frustrated me when I came back, and I went down to New Orleans and came back up to Washington, is people from schools were saying, we got all the kids in our school to pack backpacks and to put school supplies in, and we want to deliver them. How do we do that? I knew that trying to get those people down there and would cause more problems in New Orleans of people having to, you know, they were just trying to get electricity back on, and yet there was no training, no system, no way to channel the energy. And in lieu of a Red Cross doing that, I do think it's a role for government.
Bill?
I was not on the ground in New Orleans. I was at the other end. When the disaster hit, we wanted to put money in. We decided that what we wanted to do, and we put several $1 million in there, and we decided that what we wanted to do was to fund on-the-ground agencies that were really touching people and can make a difference. And we had a very, very difficult time. A lot of these people, for obvious reasons, I mean, they didn't have telephones. They didn't have, there was no electronic connection. There was no way to talk to them. And so we had a very difficult time. So we made a decision that it's not a joke. It actually was something that worked. We sent a bevy of lawyers down to represent people who were trying to get some kind of help, the sort of red tape that you were just talking about, Scott. And these lawyers basically made a difference. But I think we have to recognize, and I say this in part from my care experience, that this is complicated, and that volunteers can be a mixed blessing. And that if you have truckloads or busloads of volunteers coming in from a church and there's nowhere to put them or nothing to do, it may be that that's not what, in a disaster, that you actually need. So I want to applaud what you're talking about, which is we've got to get these connectors set up and really make them work. Yeah, absent that, it doesn't matter how many volunteers we have or how many lawyers we have or how much money we have.
And, that is what the Federal Emergency Management Agency, all 4 words of that, are supposed to be doing.
On that note, I would like to open it up to questions. I think do we have some runners with mics? I don't know if we need them. Why don't you try just this gentleman in the third row here?
Yeah, I don't need a mic.
That's excellent.
Just a quick question. You all were involved some way in Katrina and very recently in Gustav. And all of the levels of the two were different. Also, I live in Texas. We followed very closely what was happening and got very involved in Gustav with you. And the results were very different from what happened or didn't happen in Katrina to what apparently you were able to do this last time around. A world difference in the effectiveness. What happened? What primarily happened in the interim to go from such a tragedy to what appears to be a very well-run relative operation?
Well, Katrina, as I said, was such a defining moment that it was a wake-up call for everybody at every level. So I think people look back on that experience and said, we have to do a better job in the event that there's another disaster. And that started at the individual level, institutional level, certainly the city level, and the state level. So I think the last 3 years, a lot of time has been spent really revising and rethinking our emergency preparedness plans in the event of something like a Gustav. And the good news is we're not there yet to where we ought to be, but we're a heck of a lot better than we thought we would be. And Gustav, in some way, should raise people's confidence in New Orleans, that it was well organized, and in fact, we did survive it. I get a little frustrated with the news all the time because all they want to do is focus on that water coming over the levee and then drawing conclusions of that which are a little out of context. But I think it was that Katrina was a wake-up call. All of us, and Walter more so than me because I've only been in New Orleans a little over a decade, is, you know, before Katrina, the fact is a hurricane came, you just hunkered down and you stayed and you had a party. That's what you did. I mean, and you didn't leave. It was a badge of courage to stay there. That is not true anymore. That city cleared out for Gustav like that when it happened. It wasn't pretty when we cleared out with the contraflow, but we cleared out. That was a lesson learned from Katrina. Now, what we all fear is if there were never a hurricane, would they leave the next time? If Ike actually had come to New Orleans, I think we were all concerned whether people would have left because they would have said, well, we survived Gustav, we'll survive Ike. But I think I'd give credit to the fact we learned a lot in the last 3 years and things are a lot better. We'll learn even more from Gustav, quite honestly, and continue to revise our plans.
We've got this gentleman in the second row.
Yes, Phil Zarling.
Hold on. So they can show up on.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Thank you.
On the AARP board, and we're very pleased to be part of this summit. I'm concerned about lessons learned being transposed to, say, New England, where I live, Rhode Island in particular. Mr. Novelli mentioned the need for connectors, and Tulane has done an outstanding job in that respect. I wonder, have you had any inquiries from any of our institutions of higher education in the Northeast, especially New England, relative to how those institutions could help us when we get the big hit, which I'm sure is going to come soon?
You know, I told my wife the other day, when I die on my gravestone, the gravestone is going to be, he had a core competence in disasters. So the answer is we have not done wholesale sessions with higher education. We've done a lot of them, though. So we've worked with a lot of separate institutions to help educate them, and we've worked through some associations. I would say a lot of universities, but other organizations still live in a state of denial that, geez, that happened to New Orleans, it would never happen to us. And until it happens to you, never believe it. One of the lessons and messages I take all the time is bad things can happen any place, and you've got to be prepared for them. So the answer to your question is very anecdotally. We have not done it on a larger scale, and we probably ought to.
This gentleman in the third row on the aisle there.
My name is Nathan Rothstein. I'm a AmeriCorps alum. I did a year right outside the French Quarter helping with the citywide planning process and doing gutting and neighborhood rebuilding. And partly was because I came through a Hillel trip when I was in college, and I also read your article saying, "Go, young man, go down southeast."
Go south.
So, and like many others, there were thousands and thousands of other young people who came down to New Orleans post-Katrina, and last year I helped start an organization called the New Orleans Young Urban Rebuilding Professionals Initiative, and we have worked to create this coalition of young people from New Orleans, from other places who are invested in the city and want to help make connections so that the volunteers can find jobs in the city after they use their service. So one of the things we're doing is also going around the country and speaking about job opportunities in New Orleans. And I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think are some effective methods to get people from the universities, from NCCC, from City Year, to think about staying in the city after they do their service?
You know, one of the great things, as Scott said, after the storm, was how it helped change a culture of a city. We had a brain drain in New Orleans, and now we're having a brain gain. The brain gain is happening because of Tulane, it's happening because of Hillel, it's happening because of people like yourself, people coming down. When we restarted the school system, for example, people came down to start charter schools, to start KIPP academies, to start, all sorts of innovative processes. This has brought a whole new set of people to New Orleans who are impressed with the city's creativity, its excitement, and the fact that it's a more interesting place to live than in a cul-de-sac somewhere where there aren't challenges. I think we can keep that brain gain going if we get the fundamentals right. Besides the levees, to me, that means a good school system. And we had one of the worst K through 12 systems. Now I think because of so many smart, creative people coming in, that's helping. Secondly, there are 4 industries in New Orleans that support the city. There's the extraction industries, mainly oil, natural gas, and sulfur. There's the port of New Orleans, which is going to be there and hugely important. There's tourism, but to me the 4th industry is the creativity industry. Yeah. People who write, who do plays, who do art, who do music, who help build a creative society, even technology being a creative or science being creative. And the future of cities in America is not industry, but creativity. And New Orleans will be the leader as being a creative magnet for this country.
Joanna, did you have any thoughts on that?
I just wanted to say, just as far as AmeriCorps is concerned, I would just put my contact people in the administration for AmeriCorps, because as a member, I've talked with others who look for the same thing that you're trying to do after AmeriCorps is done, but it's just not in the right place. And I actually have never heard of your organization, so I just think you need to work a little bit on putting the name out there, because there are members like myself who would be interested in doing something like that, but we just don't hear from that many organizations about stuff like that. So.
Yes, ma'am, in the front row.
Hi. I want to thank you guys for your comments and the work that you're doing. I mean, if anyone has been in New Orleans, they know how important this is and that there's so much that has to be done. I'm Merlene Mazik, and I'm the director of AmeriCorps and NCCC, and Joanna was one of my members. You talked about how we engage volunteers and how we can make sure they use them. NCCC was effective because we partnered with community-based organizations. A disaster corps, which is what we have turned into in the past 3-4 years, it's not what we always did, is so important, because through having a corps that's already trained, that is team-based, and knows how to work together, you can drop them in to a disaster area, and we're already in Texas waiting for Ike, and they're ready to do that. The other piece about the Red Cross, the challenges Red Cross has is that the decentralized chapter-based structure is problematic in how you bring in folks. But you should know that NCCC, before the big Katrina, most of our disaster response was done through our partnership with the Red Cross. The first people who bring us out into disaster zones, and the first folks on the floor in disaster zones, are the Red Cross. So there has to be a way to consider how we can take what they're doing through some of those really highly effective local chapters, and I can name a few, like Delmarva in Delaware and some other places that know how to deploy members and know how to deploy disaster response people, first responders, and so that you can replicate that in communities across the country. So just be careful when we think about the Red Cross and what some of the existing organizations are doing. How do we strengthen those programs that are most effective? And how do we bring in the national component to partner with a federally sponsored disaster corps that is trained, because that is so essential. You have to be trained, and that knows how to work together so that when you drop them into those zones, that they can get moving quickly. So I just wanted to share that information.
Thank you. It's interesting how it seems like this is paralleling what's happening in the government, where, you know, this country was built to be decentralized. And unfortunately, so states and locals handle all disasters. Unfortunately, the world doesn't work like that anymore, and neither do disasters. So it's sort of the exact same problem they're having.
One other point on the Red Cross.
Yes.
I did want to mention, if we're going to have the Red Cross employ additional strategies to be more effective in partnering on the ground and tapping those chapters who are really strong to share the practices that are working so well, they have to be capitalized effectively. After Gustav, they tapped from Louisiana the national, I guess they call it the National Disaster Fund, that only had $7 million in it. And I heard the other day that their expenses to date after Gustav were reaching 75 million. So they're already nearly 70 million in the hole.
Good point. Yes, in the back, in the blue. Yeah.
I'll be quick because I know we're
running up against the end here, unfortunately. I know a lot of people.
So I'll just note, and I want to thank Giovanna for serving in NCCC, but this is timely because what was just announced in our last session with the new Kennedy Hatch bill is the potential of an alumni reserve corps. And AmeriCorps and NCCC are incredible in times of disaster, but also in times of non-crisis. And AmeriCorps are full-time stipended volunteers who can be deployed in times. And in New Orleans, there were 12,000 AmeriCorps members serving, I think, 5 million hours. So when those AmeriCorps members finish their year and go on to their lives, you know, they still are, they were trained, they are good leaders, especially good volunteer leaders. So what we hope to do with the, and I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself, I'm the Executive Director of AmeriCorps Alums, and my name's Amity Tripp. And there's 500,000 alums that are out there in AmeriCorps. Now, of course, not all are trained, and NCCC alums are. But to answer your question, Giovanna, is we hope to be able to organize in times of disaster alums who are trained and are ready to be deployed. And hopefully it will be passed in the Kennedy Hatch bill. So I want to thank you for serving in AmeriCorps as well. So what I hope is that, like you said, that alums are interested in doing that and just need to know how, so they can take two week stints to go and serve. And I think that the interesting thing about AmeriCorps and AmeriCorps alums Reserve Corps is that it will be federally funded, but locally and state deployed. So maybe there can be some kind of balance between federal and state.
Okay, thanks. One last question in the back there.
Hi, my name is John Rowan. I'm the National President of Vietnam Veterans of America. We're a relatively small organization, and frankly, one of the things I'm surprised about is my other colleagues from the other veteran service organizations don't seem to be here. And I would encourage you to invite them. We have a little disaster relief operation of our own internally to try to assist our own members. And when we were ready for Katrina, because we already had the people in Florida who had dealt with the problems in Florida and learned those lessons, and we were able to go right into work. We were helping people very locally, just, we don't have a lot of money, so we just were able to do things, people moving stuff around. We had disaster relief stuff already sitting in Florida, so it wasn't hard to transport it over to Louisiana and Mississippi. We had brought stuff in from our Texas chapters. Because I have almost 700 chapters across the country, we're able to coordinate efforts amongst our people. And I would venture to say, I know from the Legion and the VFW, they've done very similar kinds of programs. And I really like this idea of creating some sort of disaster relief corps to coordinate those kinds of efforts. We're there all the time. I mean, we don't stop. We're always doing things as long as we're alive, I guess. And the Legion and the VFW, who are much bigger than I am, are also involved in those kinds of programs. And they are everywhere. So we were in Indiana when that happened. We were up in Fargo because we have a chapter up there. We dealt with ice storms in upstate New York. We've been all over the place.
Okay, thank you very
minimal,
much.
but stuff. But if we can encourage this creation of somebody to coordinate activities like ours, and groups like ours would be going a long way, I think.
That's a great point, and I want to thank everyone for coming and thank our panelists. I'm sorry we don't have more time. Thank you, Walter. Very interesting.